In the South African context, we do have a long tradition of both pension funds being created within the public sector. So we have the Government Employees Pension Fund, which today has a accumulated capital base of just over R1 trillion. That will be what, $300 billion. We have within the work environment different types of industry pension funds and provident funds. We would have similar funds available at a municipal level, where the municipal sphere of government, as we call it, is separate from the national and provincial spheres. So there would be different types of municipal employees funds as well. So of the workforce of about some 13, 14 million people, many of these people who are working would be connected to a pension fund or a provident fund. And so within that pool, there could well be up to 2 or 3 trillion rands that is circulating. Secondly, we have a fairly well-developed governance system in South Africa, boards of trustees, governance rules, and so on. Although from time to time, you will find that the governance goes awry because asset managers of one kind or another want to persuade trustees to invest in what they, in a better moment and perhaps with less whiskey absorbed, they would make slightly different decisions. So that's where governance works up to one point in time, but the danger, of course, in that governance system is that trustees can be persuaded to move in a slightly different direction. We also have a well-developed financial sector with asset managers, asset analysts, and so on. They make a fair amount of money for themselves. One of the things that we're doing currently in government is being in the process of publishing a series of policy discussion documents which begins to review this entire system and fundamentally ask some questions about how much do people save at the beginning in terms of what they put into these systems, and what do they get out of it when they retire, and what is it that's absorbed as fees by the financial sector in one form or another. I know that's not quite on your agenda, but funds available for investment in any saving system is going to be dependent on what you put in and what you ultimately preserve, but also what is extracted by intermediaries. And so as we look at the African continent more broadly and look at what kind of, if you like, overall governance and integrity systems we're going to put in, a key challenge that's going to emerge for all of us is what do financial intermediaries extract as their fees from these funds. And as a result, and in certain cases in South Africa, we've had reports where you can save, for example, $100 at the beginning, but you walk away with only $60 at the end because $40 is extracted by the intermediaries. For some time, South Africa, through the Government Employees Pension Fund and its investment arm, which is called the Public Investment Commissioner or Corporation, which actually does the investment work of the GEPF. Much of that work is done by itself. Some of that work is outsourced to asset managers within the private sector. So we've developed skills within the PIC, as we call it, in order to have our own independent capabilities in terms of asset management as well. We've also subscribed as government to the UN responsible code of responsible investment, which means that increasingly we'll be making sure that the kind of investments that we undertake as the government pension fund is sensitive to issues of climate change, sensitive to issues of sustainability, and sensitive to the corporate governance requirements of such a code. And we are amongst the first that has actually done that. The GEPF and PIC have also taken Africa-wide initiatives to catalyze processes, and my colleagues on the panel have been talking about that, where pension funds from across the African countries and their key managers sit together and ask questions about what amounts of money do we have, how are we pooling them, how do we create better asset management capabilities within the continent, and generally how do we build up our institutional capability both to manage our own funds, but also as increasingly flows are going to come into Africa, how do we attract some of those flows as well and find the appropriate sites for investment. There are also in parallel development banks. So in the case of South Africa, you would have the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which has a long history, which also has the ability on its own balance sheet to borrow. We have other institutions such as the Industrial Development Corporation, also has its own history, has a fairly strong balance sheet of its own, undertakes investments in various economic sectors, and increasingly is applying its funds to assisting South Africa's industrial policy choices, helping to invest in renewable energy, and all of this is helping us to go forward. South Africa is also hosting the OECD Debt Management, and it's got a long title, Center. And the aim basically here is to create capacity across the African continent with this center acting as a catalyst so that we better develop debt markets on the African continent, get more credibility for those debt markets, enable governments and other public entities to borrow off those markets, and do so at a reasonable rate. So going forward, in fact, I see one of our experts is here, the former head of the PIC, so I should ask him to handle all the questions that come up, Mr. Molife. If we had to look forward for a minute or two, Africa certainly is on the threshold of great possibilities if we can mobilize all of our resources, if we can create the right kind of institutional capabilities in terms of the right skills, the right governance structures, and the right investment policies in support of infrastructure, in support of the industrialization of the African continent, in terms of investment in R&D on the African continent, so that our own innovation capabilities are increased as well. But more importantly, as foreign partners want to come into Africa, we have two choices. The one choice is to say, come in, take over, and manage it for us. The other is to say, we have sufficient muscle in every sense of that word to be effective and equal partners, so that we co-share in whatever benefits there are that arise from partnerships that are developed with other countries and entities that want to invest on the African continent. We are at the very early stages of some of these processes in many parts of the continent, and clearly what we need to do is to build up the debt markets, build up the capital markets, let stock exchanges, I think, be consolidated in some parts of the African continent so that they have more substance and weight, if you like. And we'll have to do some very creative thinking about not only how do we find funding for infrastructure, but how do we prepare projects quickly enough to make them eligible for the funding that is actually available. And again, I think we have both skills on the African continent and many friends around the world who could help us to speed that process up. Our current record in Africa is not a very good one. It takes 7 or more years to get a project from point A to anywhere near where we got to start looking for funding. And so clearly these are areas that require a lot more attention. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.